Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Jennifer Randall. I am the programs manager and the lead archivist here at the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum in beautiful Charleston, South Carolina. Today, we continue our Legacy of Freedom events to hopefully make you all even more aware of the wonderful digital collection we have of USCT pension applications. So I want to introduce the faculty from the Institute for the Study of the Reconstruction Era at USC Beaufort. We'll start with Valinda Littlefield, Dr. Valinda Littlefield. She's an associate professor of history at the University of South Carolina and interim director of the USCB Institute for the Study of the Reconstruction Era. She earned dual BA degrees in history and political science from NCCU and a PhD in history from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Littlefield specializes in late 19th and 20th century African American history, with current research focused on rural Black women school teachers during the Jim Crow era. She's the co-editor of the 3-volume South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times, and editor of 101 Women Who Shaped South Carolina. She's led major initiatives at USC, including serving as the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on University History and the 50th Anniversary Desegregation Committee. Her work includes leadership in oral history projects in Gadsden, Georgetown, and the South Carolina Rosenwald schools. She also serves or has served on the boards of the South Carolina Historical Society, South Carolina State Museum, the South Carolina Authors Academy, One Columbia, and the South Carolina Council for African American Social Studies. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Littlefield.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. We also have Rhonda Carey, the coordinator of projects and programs for the University of South Carolina's Institute for the Study of the Reconstruction Era, based in Beaufort, South Carolina since 2017. She develops and supports public programming such as the Institute's annual symposium, teacher institutes, and history series. She is passionate about community engagement, particularly with students and nonprofit partners, through collaborative learning and research projects. She also served with the City of Beaufort's Downtown Development and Community Services Department, where she planned events, managed the Main Street program, and co-chaired the Cultural District Advisory Board. Her combined experiences reflect a strong commitment to education, community, and cultural development. Thank you for joining us, Rhonda.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Elizabeth Laney is a historian and genealogist with over 20 years experience working in state parks, historic sites, and museums. She specializes in the Reconstruction Era in South Carolina history, African American communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the state's Black military legacy. Laney holds a master's in history from the University of South Carolina and a master's in museum studies from George Washington University. She's worked at Red Cliff Plantation, Drayton Hall, the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, and the Colleton Museum. Her work has appeared in Ancestry Magazine, the Journal of the South Carolina Historical Association, and other publications. She has served as research associate with the Institute since 2022. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here.
Glad to be here this afternoon.
Of course. All right, so we'll just sort of jump right in. Can you begin by telling our audience first about the Institute and what you all do?
So the Institute was founded in 2019 at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, and it has 3 main goals, shall we say. One is to increase the understanding of the Reconstruction era. That's through classes or whatever, mainly through classes at both at USCB and USC Columbia. The other one is outreach to K through 12 educators, helping them better understand the Reconstruction era, look at curriculum, those kinds of things for that K through 12 group. And the last one is community outreach.
Sure.
So
And
that's
with
it in a nutshell.
in a nutshell, what type of community outreach do you all do?
Oh, boy. Rhonda, you want to handle that one? We've gone everywhere.
Yeah. Well, we've been very fortunate. I don't have to tell folks who know this low country area well, but we're, for lack of a better phrase, Beaufort County and the surrounding low country communities is sort of a hotbed of history and legacy in terms of not only figures like the first South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, but we also have a very large, robust, rich descendant community. And so our outreach really is sort of the gamut. We, again, engage with our K-12 partners in the school district. We are partners with many other local like-minded, if you will, or purposed history and social and preservation, cultural and preservation organizations. We'll name a few of them here a little bit later on, but we really are just working always to leverage those partnerships, because we find that by doing so, what happens is while we do research and we do teaching and sharing, we're able to leverage the work that those other organizations are doing as well. So we look for partners to engage with where we can almost have a working relationship of exchange in terms of research and other resources.
That's great.
And I will just add one thing. Beaufort is unique in that by 1861, Union soldiers are taking over that area. And so Reconstruction actually starts in Beaufort while the Civil War is still going on. And so Willie Lee Rose calls it rehearsal for Reconstruction. But this is where it starts, Beaufort. That's what makes us unique and able to teach the Reconstruction period from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, excellent. Can you tell us about the research initiatives that the Institute has done in the past or is currently working on, including Mustering the First South and her mark?
We actually have several research projects, and my colleagues feel free to jump in at any point. One of the things, Mustering the First South Carolina is certainly the largest project that we've endeavored to tackle. And this project has been going on pre-COVID, as a matter of fact. And so we're now up to almost 1,400 names. And so we're looking at a database that allows us to understand who these people were. And Elizabeth will talk a little bit more about some of the things that she's been doing with that database. But that is the main one, is putting a face with those approximately 1,400 soldiers. The other research projects, some have fallen into our laps. Some people have come and asked us, would we be partners with them? And so Lincolnville, the town of Lincolnville, was an all-black town founded during the Reconstruction period, 1867, if my memory serves me correctly. And when you're thinking about Lincolnville, a group of people, two families from Johns Island, they purchased around 609 acres and formed the town of Lincolnville, and then incorporated it about 10 years later. And so we've been working with them on researching documents like pension plans for soldiers who are buried there. We've also been working with them on looking at churches, because it is truly a historical site. They still have 3 churches that were founded during the Reconstruction era. And doing just, basically trying to helping them tell the history of Lincolnville. So those are the kinds of projects that we end up with. The Northwest Quadrant, which is in Beaufort, was a space that was settled by a lot of First South volunteers. And so it was pretty much an all-black section. And now it's basically a white section with a few blacks in between. So we're trying to map that area to figure out what did it look like during this particular time period. So we've been tracking land deeds and doing all sorts of fun things with that. And Elizabeth has had both hands into that one. Rhonda's been helping with oral histories because the members of the Northwest Quadrant, the African American members who are still there, have a very rich story to tell us. And so we're trying to document those stories. So those are just some of the research projects. Did I leave one out, ladies?
I think
Or did
that's,
I?
well, we
Yeah.
are also doing a lot of research involving Reconstruction free schools in South Carolina.
Yes, yes.
The South Carolina Department of Archives and History has a fantastic collection of reports that teachers sent in between 1869 and 1871, documenting almost every school that was established in this state during Reconstruction. And so we've been digitizing those records, and similar to our work with the Mustering the First South, where we're trying to document every person, every soldier, every woman who was involved in the First South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent. We're also trying to create a database that documents all these schools around the state and the students and the teachers that participated in them, so that they can become resources for the communities where these schools were established.
I would also add one other thing, and I kind of mentioned it when I spoke before, but that's really leveraging our local historic churches that were established during the period and linking them to what we know and what we learn about these soldiers and some of the other information we glean from the pension records. And then our descendant community, linking them back, sharing information, and sort of closing the loop with and for them with their ancestors who were part of these regiments. So again, like Val mentioned, we're very blessed to be sort of in the hot seat of where Reconstruction began and the stories unfolded. And so it's been such a blessing to have such a large connection to the church community, the historic church community, and our local descendant community as we uncover stories about their ancestors, and again, do an exchange with them for the things that they've uncovered to help us tell a complete story.
That's really fascinating. And it sounds like you guys have a lot going on, and it's really incredible the way that it's all overlapping. I'm noticing throughout what we do here as far as Lincolnville. We are currently also working with Lincolnville, Dr. Pernessa Seal. She's done some amazing work in Lincolnville. I didn't grow up, but I lived in that area for about 10 years and did not know what was back there until she took us on an in-depth tour, and it's really fascinating. And then I've spoken to Elizabeth over the course of the past few months. I'm also a member of a descendant community, and she was able to find documentation about my family's schoolhouse that they went to the Reconstruction era. So that's been really fascinating too. Wow. And so anytime I think of something, I'm thinking of you guys. Are you guys already working on this? And it's really fascinating. You guys are doing tremendous work from this little tiny spot in South Carolina. You're touching the whole state. So it's really amazing.
Thank you.
Well, we're usually doing the same thing with the International African American Museum as well. What are you guys up to in doing so?
Yes.
So what has led your team to focus specifically on the USCT pension application files as a source for a lot of these initiatives?
Well, this is a resource that's becoming more and more available to people. On one hand, you do still have to go to the National Archives where the pension records are held and engage with them there, because many of them are not digitized. But then there are so many institutions. We are currently involved in digitizing them. The International African American Museum, Center for Family History, and so many other smaller groups around the country. So on one hand, it's becoming a resource that's more and more available for researchers. But I think there are kind of three main reasons why we've begun to focus so heavily on the pension records. And that's because they're an invaluable firsthand account of these Black regiments. When we look at the history of these Black regiments, there might be regimental histories written about some of the U.S. colored troop regiments. There might be some firsthand accounts, but in general, they're from the white perspective, the commanding officers. Now, with the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, we're extremely lucky to have the Reminiscences of My Life in Camp by Susie King Taylor. But that's a Black woman's perspective. Where's the Black man's perspective? Well, no matter what perspective you want, the pension records bring that white, Black, men, women, and they bring that firsthand account, whether it's the 1st South Carolina, the 2nd South Carolina, the 54th Massachusetts. So that's one of the main reasons, because it is firsthand accounts of the people who served in these regiments. But also, in terms of it being a valuable resource for studying the Reconstruction era, the pension records, the first ones were filed in the late years of the Civil War, 1864 and 1865. And in many cases, people were still applying for these pensions into the 1930s, which means it covers a broad range of history. And more historians are embracing an expanded timeline for Reconstruction. It used to be maybe 50 years ago, maybe more than that, that Reconstruction was 1865 to 1876. But now so many of us are embracing an idea of it being 1861 through 1900. And really, I hate even putting an end date on Reconstruction because so many of the issues of Reconstruction, the themes, are things that impact us today.
Yeah.
But the pension records cover that broad range of Reconstruction time period. And the last one that really makes these such a valuable resource for studying Reconstruction is the broad range of individual experiences. We study them individually, but then when you take those individual experiences, whether they're men from Florida or Georgia or South Carolina or Massachusetts or Illinois, and you put them together, you can then begin to understand a community perspective. What was Beaufort like during Reconstruction? Well, the pension records cover not only the veterans who are filling them out, but their wives, their children, their lawyers, their friends, their neighbors, their former enslavers, their lawyers. And then you can do the same thing for Savannah. You can do the same thing for Boston. You can do the same thing for communities all across the United States. So they represent a valuable firsthand account. They give us that broad range of time period perspective and give us both the individual and collective experience. And they're just such an incredible resource. I don't think I'll ever get tired of digging into them.
They also give us lots of rabbit holes to run down.
Yeah.
Which is rewarding in itself.
Yeah.
I hate to go slightly off topic. I, as the archivist, I don't do a lot of the more in-depth digging as a lot of my research colleagues here, but occasionally I do, and I get a lot less done because I fall down those rabbit holes. I've been working on a lot in Kentucky, and my lived experience is coastal South Carolina, and a lot of Gullah Geechee experiences are typically what I'm used to reading. And then reading these experiences from rural Kentucky, completely different. And I've got a million great stories, and you know that a lot of these records, some are, a couple pages, some are hundreds and hundreds of pages of these personal anecdotes about these people's lives. And they are the most unique source that I've worked with personally. So how do these pension files deepen our understanding of, say, the soldiers as opposed to traditional military records?
I think when you're looking at military records mainly talk about the battles. They may talk about a few other things, but for the most part, the pensions give us an understanding of health issues they had before or health issues they encounter once they became soldiers, how they were wounded, those kinds of things. But it also gives you a really better understanding of the people, as Elizabeth just talked about, when you're thinking about the families and you're thinking about the people in their daily lives. So it gives you a much better understanding, I say, of the folks on the ground, the home front, instead of just the military battlefield. So I think that's certainly, for me, my favorite aspect of looking at the pensions. A more holistic understanding of who the soldiers were and what they were experiencing, other than just the battles.
I agree. It is really important to get a more, like you said, holistic look at what's going on, even to give more clarity and understanding of a battle. You want to learn about people in the battle. So I definitely
Yes.
understand. So what kinds of narratives have emerged for you from these files that challenge dominant portrayals of Black life during the Civil War?
This is where that individual perspective really comes into play, because as you start to go through, and again, a lot of people do this for genealogical research. They're researching their ancestor. They may research and read 2 or 3 pension records, and we're looking at hundreds of the pension records. So when we look at those individual experiences, what really begins to form a larger narrative for me is Black agency during the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's the choices they made in school, and even in kind of state or national parks. You go and you get the general history. You may get an individual perspective here or there. But when I begin to look at this, the choices that Black men and women made to escape from their owners, to take a boat and ride out to a Union steamer ship, the choices they had to make as refugees in the initial years of the Civil War in the Low Country, the choices they made regarding their own employment, those form this really incredible narrative that shows you that how many choices Black men, women, and families had to make, and what impact those had on their lives. So Black agency and choices is one of them. But I tell you another thing that's really stood out as a narrative for me, and we'll be talking about this throughout this webinar today, but women's participation, both in the war and their experience of Reconstruction, because there were a lot of women who participated and were a part of these Black Union regiments. And in some cases, the only way you know that they were a part of this effort is through the pension records. So many of them served, so many of them signed up as laundresses, but might have been cooks, laundresses, nurses, like Susie King Taylor was, may have been packing ammo for guns and doing everything but being allowed to fight.
Yes.
And you only learn about those experiences when you see the pension records. But overall, the pension records really do allow us, especially after the war, to look at land ownership, to look at the development of literacy and education, the sustaining legacy of Black institutions. It's all covered in these pension records, and kind of allow us to create these larger narratives.
Mm-hmm. I would say too that and my colleagues are so generous in indulging my sort of obsession with the voices of women through the letters that we find in the pension file, not just the affidavits, but, well, the affidavits and the letters, with the understanding that probably the better majority of the affidavits that we find in the pension files would have been transcribed. Someone would have scribed these for these women, right? Mm-hmm. And so we hoped that they are accurate and have not been, no editorial license was taken. But I'm always struck by sort of the intention and the purpose of what you find that these women are sharing through these letters and affidavits. Mm-hmm. You can imagine that there are certain criteria for applying for a pension, right? You've got to include certain kinds of information, kind of technically. Mm-hmm. But I'm always sort of blown away when you see sort of like entire lineages talked about in mm-hmm. these affidavits. People describing what they did for work. People describing their prior life of enslavement and what that was like. And we can assume that certainly those were not things that were required to be part of those narratives in those affidavits. But I'd like to believe in my heart that women decided, when, you know, Liz talked about agency, that this is my opportunity to go on record mm-hmm. and be clear about what my life is, what my life was, and how I see the world around me. And so I'm a believer that when you see the volume of information that they share and the passion with which they share it, it is because they had agency and they wanted people to know that they did. And they understood that these were records that would be in perpetuity, right? That these would stand for time, and this was an opportunity, maybe the only opportunity, to truly be seen and heard. So I'm always struck by that. Like I said, they give me a lot of grace when I go on and get geeky about that, but it's something that I really see a through line in every time we kind of stumble on these stories through these letters and affidavits.
I just want to add one thing. When we think about, you were talking about larger narratives, just the mere fact of them applying for pensions, because everybody doesn't get a pension, and everybody doesn't get it the first time. And so you see them going back over and over, sometimes having to pay a lawyer to help them get those pensions. But again, that agency comes through in that the government owes me this. And I'm going to go at it until I actually get it, or die trying. And so you see that larger narrative of forcing the U.S. to reckon with them as citizens and being entitled to certain rights. And you wouldn't have seen that in enslavement.
And you certainly don't see a lot of the discussion of that in other types of records. And that's why these are just so valuable. To dovetail off of that, specifically looking at your project, Her Mark, that centers women's voices within these files, can you share an example or a memory from any of these pension testimonies that really stuck with you?
Elizabeth will have one, but I'm gonna start off talking about, it's not only the pension, you look at the pension plans and you look for their experiences, but then somebody like a Susie King Taylor, who writes her memoir, or Harriet Tubman, who leaves recollections of things that happened to her during this particular time period. And two stand out for me, and it's Susie King Taylor teaching people how to read and write. And so, how do you get a clearer understanding of that particular time? And then you get a Higginson talking about the African American soldiers, instead of going off drinking and doing other things, would rather stay and let Susie King Taylor teach them how to read and write. And those are very powerful narratives talking about a people at a particular time in a particular space. And I think those are the kinds of things that are extremely important to look at. But we also understand the struggle that these women have gone through. So if you take a pension plan and someone is talking about, yes, my husband left me a house, and we had a house we were renting, but it's in disrepair, and therefore I'm not making any money off that, and the only money I'm getting is through washing. So she's still struggling, and she's still fighting for her pension. But the key is, we don't get at those stories without listening to their voices. And those are her, a lot of them can't write, but they're making a mark. And
Yeah,
Elizabeth and Rhonda.
Yeah, one of the stories, as you were just mentioning that, Val, was Judy Taylor was a veteran's widow, and she actually was being interviewed on September 1st, 1893. And that specific date is important because about 3 or 4 days early, the Great Sea Island hurricane had come through. And so she mentions a lot of things in there, but she also mentions, first of all, land that her husband had owned that had passed to her. We also hear that all she owns is a house on that property, which is now unlivable because of the recent storm. But she's sitting there a couple of days after this huge, horrific event, which devastated this area. And she is sitting there telling her story to a pension agent because she needs the money now at that point more than ever. And so that testifies to a lot of things. But Rhonda was also reminding me of a story earlier, and we actually posted this story in a couple of installments on our Facebook and Instagram pages under the title Betsy's Story. Yeah. And we came across the story of a woman named Betsy Jennings, who was the mother of a soldier. And this story crosses both the antebellum period, her wartime experiences, and then after her son was died of disease just about 3 months into his service with the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent. It then chronicles her struggles to stay employed during Reconstruction, moving from Beaufort to Charleston, South Carolina, and even getting work at a prominent institution in Charleston called the Robert Shaw's Orphanage. I could sit here, Rhonda could sit here. Rhonda's been looking at letters written by these women. Val's looked at many of these records as well, and we could tell you 50, 100 individual stories, but there are mothers, there are wives, there are sisters, there are daughters. And as Val mentioned too, our Her Mark project encompasses more than just the pension records, but the pension records are where we're drawing a lot of stories that we might not otherwise have heard.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to say that, it's that persistent voice, Val mentioned that, some of the pension files are 125 pages long, affidavit after affidavit, letter after letter, this persistency, and women sort of calling out the government, if you will, and saying, I was told, to do this, that, and the other, and I would receive an answer. I sent you a letter on such and such a date, yet I have not received word back. Right. So again, reiterating what Liz said, fully understanding the agency that they had and the protections they had under the law at the early start of Reconstruction, and trying to exercise their power in that way. And so I'm often struck about how year after year after year, how many women would persist. Some never did prevail. That persistent calling back out the government. These are the things that we were promised, and this is what I want. So it is a really interesting evolution of how, through time, women became more and more sure and more strong and more willful in what they were pursuing when they were petitioning the government to get these widows' pensions.
And that has been, Rhonda and I put together a little collection, and Rhonda's been mainly looking at them, of letters written by these women. And what's interesting is page after page of these pensions will be testimony that they gave. It's being written by a white pension agent as they're being interviewed, but then tagged onto these records, you'll see a letter written by the person themselves. A lot of times these widows, and sometimes you get 3 or 4 of them, and that is where their voice really stands out, and where, as Rhonda says, she can really see that persistence, that drive to claim what's owed her, to do that persistence. But as you well know, Rhonda, those letters are just fascinating bits of history.
Yeah.
Amazing. How is your team approaching the reading, transcription, or interpretation of these documents, especially when they include dialects, scribal notations, or sometimes contradictory testimonies? And I do want to say, we had Dr. Etta Fields Black on one of our webinars earlier this month, and in her book, Cumby, she made a really good point about when they came to Beaufort and the area, they didn't understand her and she didn't understand them. And when I read that, I had to go back and reread it because it's not something I guess personally have ever thought of before, because I grew up around people with the Gullah Geechee dialects. And so I can't imagine. And then I've thought about that as I've read through pension applications in the Low Country or from the Low Country. And it does make it a lot more interesting, and it does give way to different interpretations. So how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, I want to add 2 things, and then I'll turn it over to Elizabeth and Rhonda to talk more about this. But Charlotte Fortin makes the same observation. They didn't understand her and she didn't understand them. And it's a very clear picture of when you may look like them, but you don't understand them and they don't understand you. But when you're thinking about the contradictions, we look at any document, whether it's pension plans, a letter someone wrote, a diary, all of them are suspect. And so you have to have a check and balance. And there are many ways, that historians do checks and balances. Let's say I'm doing an oral interview, and someone gives me information, then I may try to find some documents that can verify some of the things in that oral interview. Or I may try to find a document that allows me to understand the timeline that they've given me, because timelines can be off. People's dates can be totally wrong. I've been following a woman who everybody had her birthday in 1871. She's born in 1866. And so I'm able to follow that because I look at not only the census record, which too can be off, but I look at her marriage certificate, which also can be off. But I try to get as many documents as I possibly can to help hone in onto the correct information. And the more documents you have, the better you're going to be at coming as close to the truth as you possibly can. You will never get it to be 100% accurate, but you can come pretty close if you have some checks and balances set up.
Very true. We see that a lot when we're working on genealogy, which we
Yes.
frequently do here in the center. So I definitely understand.
Liz has come up with, and I'll let you share it, Liz. I know you have a system, Liz. Liz has a system, and she's gotten very, very good at just the transcription part. So I'll let her speak to that. And I'll just talk a little bit about how we engage outside of the Institute in getting some assistance in pragmatic ways of helping with transcription and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, we set up a standard kind of form so that as we're transcribing, we kind of use this same format going through and doing the transcription so that we can, because to be honest with you, majority of what we've been doing right now is still digitization and organizing the records themselves, because sometimes when you scan the records at the National Archives, they're not in the chronological order or in order of the way the pension indexer put them together. So we've only gotten a little bit into the actual transcription itself. But when we do get to transcription, we use kind of a general form. We're usually looking at the same type of documented deposition, which is kind of the primary interview with the claimant and the pension records. So we try to do that. But we really are, Rhonda had shared this idea with me, trying to find people in the community who might be more familiar with Gullah speech and dialect, because as the person is being interviewed, they are speaking in their dialect, but the person recording their information isn't necessarily recording their dialect. But we feel, Rhonda was telling me this idea earlier. She said, if we can engage people in the Gullah Geechee community, they might actually be able to find those nuances in what that white pension agent recorded that tells us about the Gullah culture and the Gullah dialect. I mean, one example I can think of is I was reading through a pension record and it mentioned a woman's basket name. Had no idea what a basket name was. Now that was something I could look up and discover. And it, turns out to be a personal name, given within the community. But someone who is familiar with the culture could be reading these, helping us transcribe them and say, hey, this wasn't obvious, but most women are mentioning this, or most men are using this word, and this is a part of the intrinsic part of the Gullah Geechee culture. So.
Yeah. And I'm working on a really fun project with a group that we've done some things with in the past, whether we've shared with them and done some exchanges with them. They're out on St. Helena Island, and they're a group of seniors who meet every single week. They're the sassy seniors. They're not crocheting toilet paper covers. They're interested in history. They're interested in preservation. Again, many of them, most of them Gullah Geechee, and most of them able to read cursive writing, because that in itself is a stumbling block. Cursive writing, like Latin, is a dead sort of situation, right? It's not a language, but people now that are coming up in Gen Z and even some millennials cannot read cursive writing. And so sometimes there's a little bit of support and effort in trying to get people to understand just cursive writing. And as I was digitizing, for the first time, I went to the archives and I had a nice trip with Liz, and we were doing pension files. The different types of cursive writing Even as someone who, trust me, learned cursive writing, I'm aging myself. Some of those, they vary so much that it can be difficult. And so I found myself having to almost make a legend where once I just sort of figured out, oh, that's how that person does a J, or that's how that person does the letter H, so it can be very, very, very tedious. But I think we've been wholly committed in everything we do. Just like Val mentioned, this whole thing of getting additional documents to sort of verify and confirm. We're very committed to making sure whenever we're transcribing or looking through these records and telling these stories, that they're as accurate and as close to the voice of the individual as they could possibly be. And sometimes that's comparing those affidavits and materials that were written by other people that the story was told to, versus fast forward 10 years where maybe someone then has learned to write, they've become literate, and looking for similarities or differences in what was said in their to capture the voice. Do you know what I mean? So it's like now that she is writing her own letter and you compare that to something that was maybe scribed for them, you can kind of, try to get closer to their voice in that way. So it is, I find it challenging. And I had to kind of just find a couple of tricks to try to help me, but it is not a fast process, at least not for me. Liz is probably better.
It's not a fast project.
No.
Understood. Cursive is definitely a stumbling block. We've run into with a lot of people who want to volunteer. It's very unfortunate, but it's just one of those things.
Yeah.
So what ethical considerations guide you guys when sharing deeply personal or potentially sensitive information found in the pension files with the public?
Yeah. Well, we haven't really gotten to that point yet where we're sharing lots and lots of information. When we think about sharing the pension files, it's been from our partners who have either directly asked us for information about a certain person, and you share that with them because that more than likely they're descendants. So we share whatever we have with them. Certainly we've seen some things, but we're not at that point. From an ethical standpoint, as a historian, I'd probably say the one touchy thing that we're going to have is land. People taking land, stealing land, especially later on during that Reconstruction period. We know of descendants who have experienced that in the 21st century. Land that was purchased during the Reconstruction period, and then all of a sudden it disappears out of the family line. And so there are names to be had. And so how we're going to share that, we really haven't talked about that yet. And we will pull together a group of people, including the lawyers, to talk about what we can share, if we find something, what we can share and what we can't share. As far as when you're thinking about, for me, anything that, let's say we have a descendant's, we have a pension plan and a descendant says, I don't want people to know that they had 2 or 3 wives. We have to honor that. The pension plan, somebody else can go pull that pension plan and pull that. But if we're going to put that up on our website, we're not going to talk about their 2 or 3 wives because that descendant has asked us not to. For whatever reason, it's not something I would do or possibly my colleagues would do. We're historians and let it all be. That's our history. But everybody's not like that. And so we will honor, if somebody doesn't want something up on their ancestor, we will not publish it.
There are also some really deeply personal stories in there about these people's lives. And going back to women again, it is really terrible, the questions that some of these women are asked, because they had to prove their marriage and their fidelity. And after their husband was dead, they had to prove that they weren't sleeping around. And and they go into some pretty explicit terminology. And those are types of things that as we reach the point where we've digitized, organized, transcribed these files, and as we want to share them with K through 12 teachers, university students, descendants, the general public, then, what level do we go to protect the privacy of those people in the past, or to make
Right.
sure that it's shared, but in a respectful way? So
Yes.
those are certainly things that we are going to be thinking about here within the next year or two as we start to get these to the point where we are putting them out there and sharing them with the general public.
I thought of something else too, is, each of the pension files, there are so many medical records that are contained
Yes.
in them. A lot of times, these men were given physicals and they were trying to prove their level of disability at some point and so forth. And so what we came to understand, and it wasn't until we sat down with a woman who is a medical doctor, we sort of like were saying, well, these medical records, we don't have the expertise, the time to really kind of deal with them. Well, she's a doctor, and she's also a citizen historian, and has an ancestor of great import, who's actually Valentine, who's actually featured in the Cumbie book by Dr. Etta Fields Black. But she said, that's one of my favorite parts, largely because of her interest and her experience as a medical doctor. But she believes there's a whole nother set of stories embedded in those medical records. So when you look at ethics, you think that, well, we're not medical doctors.
Right.
And while we can maybe read a medical report that's straightforward, we can see all these charts and pictures, which are very explicit. We can read a story that a widow writes in a letter, a passage in a letter that says, he lost his arm, or he had back problems, or whatever. We're certainly not, I guess, qualified to begin to tap that portion of the file or that portion of the story. So I think some of the ethical restraint has to be around what you really know you can get your arms around, right? And what you can really understand before you convey it or attempt to interpret it for other people. So I think that's something to always think about too, is there's a lot in those files that, to be plain, we ain't got no business messing with, because we just don't have the expertise or the background or experience to clearly interpret it and then share it out.
Right.
I agree. I've seen a few records with the more in-depth medical breakdowns and diagrams and things. And that's something that's been at the forefront of my mind when looking at this. Some of these people might have genetic conditions. Do we make that public? What are the long-term ethical implications with AI keeping this information? Is this going to affect their ancestor or their descendants' life insurance or something? There's just so many things that need to be weighed out, and like you said, we don't have the expertise for that. I don't have that many extra letters behind my name, unfortunately.
And if we just go old school with it, what did our moms and grandmas tell us? Every story doesn't have to be told.
Doesn't have to be told.
Plenty of stories in those files that are rich and illuminating and give us context and historical information. But every story doesn't have to be told, and I think that's okay too.
Yes.
That's a great point. We're coming up on time, so I'll just ask one more question, and then we have a couple questions in the chat. If anybody else has any questions for the faculty of ISRE, please drop them in the chat. Looking forward, what are your hopes for how this body of work might influence future scholarship, especially at the intersection of African American history, community memory, and archival studies? I know that's a lot.
One thing I hope that it helps is a better understanding of a group of people who literally pushed the U.S. in looking at the Constitution, its Bill of Rights, from a different perspective, and living up to those ideas that we professed. And I think this particular group, especially the First South, everybody in the First South, not just the men, but the women, the children, the community members, I think they allow us to understand that long-term struggle, to better understand that they had a long-term vision. It wasn't short-term like we are today. I want it now. They prepared for future generations in purchasing land, in building schools, all of those things. And I think we as a nation can learn a lot from that, So I'm hoping if nothing else comes out of this, that some of the research of comparing then and now, that we will come to a better understanding of a model that actually might allow us to have a democracy.
That's great.
I would say real briefly too, it's the hope that people would see in the stories of the people that we try to illuminate, and the stories that we try to illuminate about the people, is just this persistent, innate drive for freedom, and how that's a constant thing that needs to be worked at and worked on. And I think these stories help us to see that it was very much understood what freedom could mean, what the tenets of freedom meant to people: land ownership, agency, what you're owed, by the government, and what promises need to be kept to you as a person to truly be free. And so I would hope that as we share these stories and these lessons with young folks and folks alike, that they'd understand that the price of freedom is something that has to be paid over and over again, but that it's possible.
Yeah, and I think too that when I look how it's going to influence the future of scholarship, being able to put these resources in the hands of our K through 12 teachers, who will then expose younger students to them. And when we put them in the hands of teachers and students at the university level, again, because they're going to get to know those individual experiences, it's going to open up history for them in a whole new way. In a way, I feel like it's more important for people to be looking at these individual experiences, because that's what they're going to connect with. And then they get interested, they'll read more and more, and they'll start to see what we've naturally seen too, what we as historians already know, these larger narratives coming in, and they'll find those narratives because they've looked at those individual experiences, and they can be so powerful to engage students, to engage the individual person.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So we do have a few audience questions. So Lanice Hollister is stating that she had a pension record for a sailor from a warship off of the SC coast who eventually settled in Philadelphia. Are you coming across many pension applications of sailors?
Well, first of all, hi, Lanice. It's really good to see you. She's all over the place here in South Carolina. Went to a wonderful presentation of hers a couple of months ago at the State Archives. No, we are not, but for a very good reason. A lot of our research has focused on the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, an infantry regiment. Now, because that we have this focus on the Army, we're not pulling a lot of sailors' pensions. However, even though we are focusing on this infantry regiment, there are a number of men within those that regiment who, in their pensions, they say, yeah, I served for the Navy for a short time.
Right.
One of them is a Sergeant Julius Shematella, whose descendants we are in contact with, and his pension record is full of his naval service. Almost every single person, every single veteran in those pension records, though, is asked, did you have prior service to your service in this specific regiment? Most of them say no, but again, we do find a few. If we were concentrating on a naval regiment, those records are available in the National Archives. Jennifer, are you guys collecting Navy pensions as well for your digital archives?
Not specifically, but we do have a few specific instances. I'm not super keen on them. I know that one of our researchers, Darius Brown, has mentioned them to me over the last few months, at least a handful.
Yeah. Well, that's the space where African Americans could serve prior to the Civil War. So, yeah.
All right. So Sandra Henderson has a question. What if you found a pension record and then you go back to get it again and it's gone? I can sort of answer this. This happens a lot. Archivists aren't perfect. Often also researchers aren't perfect, and sometimes things go back to the wrong place.
Yes.
And so it is unfortunate. It does occur. my advice is to keep checking back for it periodically. Also, look for other partners who have been digitizing these records wherever you're located. You might have a state or a more locally focused organization who is doing a similar project and may have already digitized the record in the past. But I hope that helps. I know that's not like the greatest answer, but
No, but it helps.
Let's see. And then Phaedra Thomas wants to know, have those Black churches around during Reconstruction received historical status or markers with some of the research that you all have done?
For the Lincolnville churches, yes, they had received historical status because of the town of Lincolnville is a historic town. So everybody in the town, every building in the town has a historic status. So our work is just going to add to the foundation that they had already.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
for the three churches in Lincolnville, we're also looking at that connection between Charleston. Because all three churches come out of a connection from Charleston, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And I would say that the churches here locally have long had those designations.
Yes.
But I think of a church like Wesley United Methodist, where while they had their historical marker and designation, since we've not a lot because of the work that the church historic committee did themselves, there have been some additional ways for them to illuminate the historical nature. And I think about the Francis Whipper. Finally getting a headstone sort of monument at the church there. So I think sometimes we're seeing an evolution of other kinds of designations and memorials and things of that nature being added as more of these historical institutions dig deeper. And then, of course, several of the churches are getting on the network now. The National Park Service has a historical network of sites. And so we're seeing that evolve through the work they're doing at the National Park Service here locally.
And the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission has a special funding opportunity for churches and really places connected to Black history around the state. They have a special fund every year that helps people within these communities identify churches connected with Reconstruction, other historic spaces, and so that we can increase those numbers of markers that are speaking to our diverse history that we have here in South Carolina.
And I'm going to have to scoot out. My apologies, but my two colleagues got the questions. So if there are more questions, they have it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Littlefield. All right, so unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. I just want to again thank all the faculty from the Institute for spending a little bit of time with us today, and thank them for their incredible work. I don't know how you guys are doing it. You have your hands in a lot of pots right now, it sounds like, but you're doing amazing work. So thank you. And I wanted to reiterate that the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum is actually now the largest holder of digitally accessible USCT pension records. So you can access that through the iaamuseum.org, and you can go into the Center for Family History and into our digital archive and look through the records that we have so far. We are continually adding more records. If you have any questions about any of those records, you can email me directly or CFH directly. And I believe Elizabeth has put their information if you have any questions specifically for ISRE at USC Beaufort. And again, I wanted to thank everybody for coming in today. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, unfortunately, unlike IAAM, who has so many wonderful records available online, most of the pensions we've digitized are not available just to the general public. We do plan to have those in upcoming years, but I put all of our contact information into the chat, so you're welcome to email us. It turns out there is a descendant of Betsy Jennings, whom we spoke about earlier, who is watching the webinar today. Whether you're a descendant or you're interested in those pension files, They may not be available online, but you can email us and we're happy to send you a list of the pension records we do have, share those with you. If you're a teacher and want to engage in the classrooms, reach out to us, and all of our staff are available and happy to help in whatever we can do to promote the history in your communities as well.
And please feel free to join us March 20th and 21st here in Beaufort on the campus of USCB for our 4th annual symposium. It is free, it is open to everyone, and you can get the information, and we'll keep adding more information as we go along, but you can get the information as to how to register and attend on our website. Please come down and join us.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and thank you for everyone for joining us this month for Legacy of Freedom as we celebrate the United States Colored Troops and our digital archive dedicated to those pension applications. Thank you, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Jennifer. Bye.
Bye.